Hi, friends. Welcome back to the Better Events podcast. I'm Logan Clements, one of your co hosts. And in this week's episode, we are talking all about the art of better event programming. Both Mary and I have experienced some frustrating on site experiences where we've seen things play out that could have been avoided if folks had adjusted their programming, whether it's their keynote, your general session, your breakouts, whatever's happening on stage. There are things you can do to set you up for success on site. So Mary and I will share some tips and tricks we have, why it's so important, some pitfalls we've seen clients make, and hopefully make your next event programming just that much better. And before we jump into the episode, we do want to remind you to buy tickets for the Better Events Conference this December. You have 2 more days to take advantage of our early bird pricing on both of our all access, which is both days, ticket, as well as our general admission ticket, which is for Thursday, the 19th of December only. That's our virtual ticket. This will be the lowest price you're going to see for any of our conference tickets. So we want you to take advantage of that special discount. Don't worry, if you need some more time to decide, you are able to take advantage of this afterward. It is just going to be at our full price. So hope you can join us. Visit bettereventspod.com/conference to find out more. Now, without further ado, let's get into the episode.
Welcome to the Better Events Podcast. Join 2 event strategists, Logan Clements and Mary Davidson, who believe we can all create, host, and attend better events. In this podcast, you will learn about event strategy and actions that you can use today as an event host, planner, or manager. Hear directly from the people who are creating innovative and inspiring events today and tomorrow, and grow your business along the way. Now, let's get started, and thanks for listening to the Better Events Podcast.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another week of the Better Events Podcast. We are so happy to be with you as always. Today, we are talking all about the art of better event programming, and we're excited to get into this discussion. But before we do, we have our conversation starter. So, Logan, hello. And Halloween is just a few weeks away. So, what is your favorite Halloween candy? Well, as a kid, let's do that. Your favorite Halloween candy as a kid.
As a kid in my trick-or-treating prime, I loved Reese's. I still love Reese's. But I remember, like, in the currency of sorting my candy post trick-or-treating and trading with my siblings, my Reese's were valuable. I was really not going to separate with those. So Reese's peanut butter cups, and specifically the full-size ones. I don't think the peanut butter to chocolate ratio in the little minis is up to par. I really like the full-size ones.
Hot take. Okay. I would say mine are the mini Twizzlers, but it's the Halloween candy mini Twizzlers specifically. I don't like a big Twizzler. I like the Halloween candy fun size Twizzler. They have their own specific taste, and they're amazing. If you know, you know. Logan, you clearly don't know.
Now it took me a second, but now I can picture it. And yes, the licorice consistency, the chewiness of it is different.
It is Twizzler, right? Now that I'm saying that.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Twizzler. Oh my gosh, I love it. So hopefully you're thinking of fondly of whatever you used to trick or treat for. But why we picked this week's topic about the art of better event programming, I will say, listeners, it's a little bit maybe because we're a little bugged. We're a little annoyed because sometimes these decisions have been made before we get brought on, and yet then we get to deal with the consequences. So the bugged part, listeners, know it's a little tongue in cheek, but this is just one. If we had the opportunity to make some of these choices and these recommendations based on our experience and actually seeing how they play out, we're going to talk about just some simple things that you can do to make the most of your programming and your content without overloading or wasting energy in places that maybe you don't need to. So, Mary, when we say programming, what do we mean? And why is it an art, quote unquote?
In this case, for the episode, when we say programming, we're talking about the content, as Logan pointed out before we started this episode, the things that are happening on the stage, if there is a stage, basically with the presenters, like that stuff, that program that is going on during those moments. And it's an art because it just is. No, it is because it's complicated. And there is like a flow and something that you have to kind of like weave to make it work well together as a whole when you're looking at your whole event, what makes sense with the programming. And so that's why I think it's an art. Logan, why do you think it's an art?
I mean, it goes back to episode 2 of the podcast where we talked about your North Star and your event why. I think just thinking through some frustrating experiences that I've had over the years, it often is when there's a disconnect between what programming you put on and what the goal of the event was. And then usually you have frustrating results. And so, yes, programming is the stage, or as you pointed out to me too, like it can be your breakouts, your other content that doesn't have to physically need a stage. That's just where my brain goes, is anything that's happening, you know, the programming piece is what's happening on stage. And I think some folks, that's an afterthought, or they just repeat what they did in years past, and yet are continued to be confused of why they're not retaining attendees. Um, and or I feel like they try to do too much, and then they're just confused with why they have, certain feedback. So that's why I'm excited to talk about this a little bit more with you, Mary. But programs look different for each event. So what are some tips on scheduling the day and not over scheduling the programming?
I think that this is like a robust conversation. I think there's so many tips that we could probably give. And mostly because, well, kind of what Logan hinted to, but for myself, I've just experienced a lot of things where I was like, wow, wish we could have been more a part of this to prevent this from happening. So yeah, just some true pain points along the way here. But I would say some tips on not over scheduling the program. So I feel like we've seen this over the years develop. And Logan, I'd love to get your thoughts on that too. But I think that we're in a space in the event industry where there's a lot of opportunities to try something new with the programming and the content. And I think that's so exciting. Never before have I been that interested in programming and content until now, because I feel like there's space to do something new, fresh, fun. And so, with that in mind, I think what we're seeing is that we need to have breaks and maybe start a little later, just something as simple as that. And breaks happened before, but like really intentional breaks. And breaks that, do provide some type of value within that time. Maybe like a wellness break, or like time for somebody to actually get a snack, like those types of things. I think we're putting a little bit more humanness in the programming component. And we see that within like a session itself or a keynote itself as well, I think, with the length of time that things are taking. So I could keep going, but Logan, let me pass it to you for now. What are some tips that you're seeing with scheduling the day?
Yeah, I think my production brain kicks in, like for how I build a production schedule, is I often work backwards from whatever, the event start and end time. And then I figure out, what I can fit in terms of, and making sure we have rehearsal time and meal breaks. And you talk about breaks and things. And so that's how I work. And so thinking about your program for your event, you do kind of need to reverse engineer it. And it is something that Mary, you and I are doing for the Better Events Conference, because I think so many folks get overwhelmed with the nitty gritty, or the number of speakers, or the number of things they want to say, but they don't actually time it out and figure out what do they even have space for. Because first you got to figure out how much space you've got. Then you got to figure out what do you want to prioritize, while also, like you said, Mary, injecting that human piece, having those breaks in there. And so that to me is something that, like, just mapping out. Again, conference maybe is where you see this more often be such an issue, because they want to provide so much content, they want to have so many speakers and so many things, that it all of a sudden becomes overwhelming, and they've added too many tracks. And we can get more into that. But one example I will use is, like, I had a nonprofit client that had feedback from attendees where they said, the year prior, they kind of, the minute they got in the room, they had some cocktail hour, and then they sat at their table, and then we really kind of talked at them the entire dinner. And then once the program was done, that's when they could get up and they would, socialize. But then they pretty much only had about 15, 20 minutes socializing. Then they had to leave. And so they had feedback where someone said, you've asked me to put together a table, bring my friends and family together. Like, I want time to hang out with my table and then enjoy your programming. And so what they ended up doing was shifting their entire schedule to make space, 45 minutes for dinner service and nothing happening on the stage, while still maintaining their program that they were doing. So this ended up just shifting some things, and giving them space to still do. They did a panel discussion, and then they did kind of a fun to need portion as well afterward. But they then kind of had to figure out their parameters of, like, okay, well, if people want more time, that means they'll probably come maybe a little earlier, or they want to stay a little later. And they adjusted, and then they were able to adjust their timing. So I think reverse engineering how long you want to go for your event, and then figuring out what you actually have time for, and cutting things. It's probably the hardest thing. I feel like, if anything, I see a lot more people are just over scheduling is the trend that I see. And so I'm always proud of a client that adjusts or cuts, but it's always easier said than done.
I love what you said. And like you said, because we're experiencing this as we're planning the Better Events Conference, it's so nice to be on this side. So if you're an event planner and you're not as involved in the content or programming, if there's an opportunity that you can to be involved, whether you're volunteering for some local committee for something like a programs committee or something, like to really be a part of that, I think is a super valuable experience, because the moment that you, I don't know, start thinking about that more fully, it impacts the event because it impacts your timeline, like when food's being served, all of those things. So yes, Logan, I love what you said. And something else that I was thinking about is, yes, people are overpacking their days, and at the end of the day there is only so much time, and it seems like every time I've been involved in this process, like you said, there has to be a cut. There's never as much time to do everything you want. I'm consulting for one event right now, and it'll be a type of conference. It's kind of an unconventional conference, but one of their four main goals is wellness for that industry, and that is not happening in the current flow of programming or agenda because they have to offer continuing education credits. And those credits have to be 60 minutes for this organization. And so it's just super hard, because at the end of the day, like, we just don't have that much time, because there's only so much we have to choose, what sessions we want to have, because each of them have to be 60 minutes. And then on top of that, like, it cuts into our time where we wanted to do wellness moments or breaks and things like that. And so it's something that we're working through right now, but it's hard. That's why also I think it's an art, is it's not terribly easy to figure this type of stuff out. But we as event professionals, I think, can provide a lot of helpful information, even if we're not the ones creating the programming content.
Yeah, and I think you made a good point there. Is you're probably not going to be able to put everything you want into an event. Like, you have to prioritize. It is impossible for every piece of content you want to put in an event. You're probably not going to find space for it unless you're someone who has budget to extend a day or do multiple tracks or anything. I mean, that's why in my head, reverse engineering it and figuring out how many slots you have. That's like what we've done with the Better Events Conference, because it's been like, wow, we want to have these 15 amazing speakers. And then we look at our schedule and we go, oh, dang, we probably only have space for 10. And that's what we're working with to save those breaks. Cause I think I've definitely experienced it executing wise, that certain things get shifted because they need to make someone happy and add this session. And all of a sudden it has the trickle down effect where now breaks are only 10 minutes long, which then means if a speaker goes over, now your break's only 7 minutes long, or it's shifting everything. Like, you're not giving yourself any buffer. So that's a big thing. Like, breaks are helpful from a wellness perspective, like you mentioned, Mary, but also logistically. Having breaks gives you that buffer to catch up when you have, a long day. If you are things are too closely scheduled together, it's just, you're not setting yourself up for success. You're making your schedule that you've published or put places kind of obsolete because everything's shifting. And then also taking into account your venue. If you're doing everything in one ballroom and all it is people come in and they're in one place, you probably have a little more flexibility with your breaks. You don't have to be as robust. If you're doing something that has people going to breakouts, to additional spaces, you have to account for what the venue looks like. How long does it take to get from one area to another? I've done a couple of shows in like hotels that have like a new tower and an old tower, and the keynote's in the new tower, but then they have to all walk to the old tower for breakouts. And it's like, you have to account for that walking time. And that's not really a break, because they're really moving to get from one to the other. So then you gotta pad it there. So I think just breaks is a big one. And then Mary, we can dive in, I think, more into this about doing concurrent sessions. I'm going to first touch on this from the budget perspective, is usually what I have a conversation, because I'm doing the production for stuff. People don't realize how expensive concurrent things can be. And that's because you have concurrent, meaning multiple things at once, meaning if you want 3 rooms going at once, you need 3 teams or 3 projectors and projection screens, 3 audio systems. Like, everything is a plus to add another concurrent thing. Now, your goal is maybe to make 3 different groups or 3 different interests happy. So that's why you're doing it. So then you can rationalize the cost. But that is one that I found some people are very surprised at, is by doing concurrent things, it's more expensive than if they staggered them in the main room. So you gave one group a break and you did the other group's breakout in the main room and then rotated in the next group. That's a cost savings, and you're achieving the goal of giving your attendees a break. But Mary, I feel like you have some experience with some concurrent sessions that maybe were too many.
This is fresh in my mind. So Yes, this is one of the reasons this topic was born for sure. Yeah, we were recently part of an event, and at one time there was like 14 concurrent sessions, which was crazy. And just from Logan's point, logistically, what that actually takes to do, we maxed out this whole venue. We took every little spot. We had sessions outside, like we were doing all of the things. Um, but my understanding is one of the reasons is just they had a lot of speaker interest, and so they wanted to be able to highlight as many speakers as they could. It was some really solid session content that the speakers were bringing. But what we found is there were some sessions, because we were checking in, making sure that things were flowing and all of that, that didn't end up having any attendees. So it really diluted the experience. And so we had some speakers who just said, like, they were nice, but they were like, yeah, I'm not going to obviously do this. Nobody's here. So they just packed up and left. And so that is a negative experience. And because they said yes to all of these speakers, it's less likely that these speakers are going to want to come back next year, because they probably didn't have a wonderful experience with their diluted audience. And instead, if they had just built that, the desire or for the people to apply next year and then maybe be able to get in, you know what I mean? Like, they're really building that excitement and the momentum, and I don't want to say competition, but people, there's that energy there for people to come back again. And I think they kind of lost that because they chose to do too many concurrent sessions. And so this was a problem for a lot of reasons. But from the concurrent standpoint, it is an example of probably a miss, I would say.
This is where I just think, as an event organizer, it is your responsibility to curate that schedule a little bit more, because I can definitely see those meetings where you're like, well, all 14 of these sessions are so important and they're so valuable to our attendees. And it's like, yes, but would you rather have 7 very well attended sessions and leave, like you said, Mary, those other 7 people wanting more, or having to apply again next year, than having 14 where you're too spread out? Yeah, as the event host or organizer, I think it's your responsibility to prioritize these things. And as a planner, we do have the opportunity to kind of provide that outside, consulting view of these things. And sometimes, for me, it's either to go delicately if you have a group that's a little bit more political about why certain people are getting to be speakers and others aren't, or that whole process is just delicate. Just putting some of these hypotheticals out there. Like, do we still think this 14th session's a success if we only have 10 people in that room? Or maybe we had 1,400 people expected this event. You're doing 4 breakouts. That means maximum you're going to have 100 people in a room. And some of your breakout rooms might be really big. So visually, these might look a little not very full. Or I had another client who put them in a survey to attendees, all the sessions, and said, please indicate your interest. And then based on that indicated interest, assigned rooms based on quantity. So if a lot of people signed up for that session, that got put in the bigger breakout room. If not as many, it went in the smaller breakout room. So it wasn't necessarily voting yes or no, but it was saying, here's all the sessions. And then that's how they scheduled the day. They didn't necessarily do one track, one room. They have people moving around a bit, but they're able to do it based on capacity. So that's another interesting take to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great. Great for sure. Yeah, content is hard. Like, when I think of valuable and interesting content, one of the things that kind of pops into my mind is a great tool from Julius Solaris. And so if you follow him, we know that he's, a voice in the industry about different engaging things that you can do. And there's one that I actually refer to pretty often because it talks about different event formats that really drive engagement when you're talking about content. And so there are so many different things. He talks about, like, an Ask Me Anything session, a walking session, a live podcast. We're really resonating with some of these right now. But there's even ones that he says, like panel battles, or an empty chair panel, which is where you get a member of the audience to join the panel sporadically. I think a lot of us have heard of, like, the fishbowl technique, where you sit in a circle and there's some chairs in the middle. There's another one that is like a pitch battle. We've seen something like that before, but I don't know. I just really love the idea of picking something that's just a little unique. It's something that I have found harder to convince clients to do, because there's, like, value in just safety of a panel, or something pretty similar. I've seen folks try to do, like, a TED Talk situation a little bit more lately, and that's even a little bit more interesting. But it's just so important, I think, to be able to shake it up. And the key, though, is not just to shake it up, it's to provide valuable content. And a lot of that comes in how it's delivered. So if you can identify some of those moments that you're looking for and have a speaker who's willing to work within that, I think could really be a valuable use of your time in a conference. But Logan, do you have any tips on more tips on content or how to keep it interesting and valuable?
Yeah, I think finding that intersection between what your goals are as the organizer and what your attendees want, and admitting that you're gonna leave some people out. Like it is impossible to create an event that hits everybody's needs, wants, and needs. It's impossible. And we're seeing this at the Better Events Conference as we organize it. We love all the feedback, but looking at all the topics, it is physically impossible for us to touch on everything unless we hosted like a 50-hour conference. Like, and that's just too much. Like that's, or 72 hours of just constant speakers at you. So yeah, I think thinking through making sure those two goals. And then to Mary's point, like we love mixing something in that's fun and different. Like I just did an event that I was floor managing for, and they did lightning talks, which are 5-minute talks. Now, did every speaker truly talk for 5 minutes? It was leadership team. That was tougher for them than I thought. But giving the parameters to a speaker, if you have 5 minutes, they got to their point. Maybe it took them 6 or 7 minutes, but it was snappy and it was fast, and it did achieve getting more information to the attendees, but in a shorter amount of time, saving energy for the attendees. So just thinking through different ways that you can play with your program. But so much of what I see is over programming, Mary, and that is really what I feel like is the bigger issue than under programming. It's often that people are trying to fit too much. So thinking about what can you take away, what break can you lengthen, what can you shorten? Can you make that panel 30 minutes instead of an hour? We just had our episode last week about being a better attendee. And that is something that I am constantly, when I'm an attendee, making notes about timing, of just realizing like, wow, 60-minute panel, you're like, it's so deep as an organizer. You're like, we need those 60 minutes. And then you're the attendee sitting with the butt in the seat and you're like 60 minutes, they've lost you after 35 minutes. So that's where I think I would just challenge you to reevaluate some of your timings, see what you could shorten, and what maybe, I think also in our episode we did with Liz Lathan that she said, what could have been a podcast? What topics could have been a podcast? Or like what we're doing with the Better Events Conference, it's brain bites. We're doing some on-demand content, knowing we are not going to make our attendees sit through that many sessions, but we're going to make them a library so you, when you have time, can go back and watch. And then you have that, you have that resource available, but it's not taking time out of your day at a set time and making our event really long.
I love that. And one other thing I wanted to mention too is just when you're planning this content, pre-planning it, because what you need to be able to understand from the planning perspective is like what the rooms also need to be set up as. Like, is this best as a workshop? Do you need it? Like, is there a room flip that's involved, or can you get away with just having people move their chairs in circles? Like these types of things, because these last minute switches are very expensive on site. And so like you have to get ahead of not only the content, but what does that mean for the room and the setup within it? And so that's another thing I definitely wanted to call out.
Yeah, Mary, I think you make a great point about thinking about layouts and room flip. One last point I want to make before we wrap up here, because again, we could keep going on about event programming. Maybe we need a part 2 for this, but thinking about room capacities based on your program. So this is something that maybe you need to be a more experienced planner to do, or more experienced event. Like you've been around for a couple years, so you roughly know your audience size. Like I'm going to be a 100-person conference. I'm going to be a 200-person conference. I'm going to be a 800-person dinner, because that can help you when you're planning what venue you want to be in, because sometimes your constraints are going to be limited by the amount of space you have at the venue. How many breakouts can you do? How many different rooms, or what are the capacities of those rooms? Or thinking about just like a dinner, how much space do you have between the tables if you want people getting up and moving around to talk to each other? Is that even feasible based on the number of bodies you're trying to put in the room? So this is again where we see challenges come up, because there's a disconnect between the space and capacities and then the programming and what they're trying to get attendees to do. So hopefully that gives you a couple ideas about the art of event programming, helping you make a better event. But Mary, you have our bonus tip this week.
I do. Okay, so for our bonus tip today, it's when you're doing boxed lunches for an event, make sure that you're ordering enough. Boxed lunches are obviously different because it's not a buffet where food can kind of stretch. It's like one lunch for every single person. So when you're out, you're out. So this is your friendly reminder when you're doing boxed lunches for a meal, make sure that you're definitely going to have enough. And that's our bonus tip for today.
Amazing. Thank you, Mary. This brings us to the end of our episode. You can follow us on social media at Better Events Pod. You can send us an email at bettereventspod@gmail.com or connect with Mary and I directly on LinkedIn. We love hearing from you. And if you want more Better Events content, register for our 2024 Better Events Conference at bettereventspod.com/conference and join our private community on Substack. As always, we thank you for listening, and we'll be back in your feeds again next Wednesday.